Hello and welcome to AFAL Podcasts, the home of objective, up-to-date and independent reporting on Turkey. Don't forget to follow our reports through social media, on afalnews.com or through our mobile app. Let's get started.
Hello and welcome to Aval Pod. This is David Lepeska, Aval English Language Editor. Joining me today is Ahmet Kuru, political science professor at San Diego State University and author of a new book, Islam, Authoritarianism, and Underdevelopment. Hello, Ahmet, and welcome.
Hi, David. Thanks for having me.
Sure. Let's set aside the book for now. In your recent piece, you highlight the similarities in the swift falls of Egypt's Muslim Brotherhood and Turkey's Gülen movement, Islamist groups that were both riding high in early 2013. The Muslim Brotherhood in power in Egypt and the Gülenists with considerable influence in state institutions in Turkey, and today have been labeled terrorist groups and all but wiped out in their respective countries. Why did you choose two groups in particular?
Yeah, so David, in fact, I've been thinking of this comparison for many years, but as I gave a speech a few months ago in Washington, D.C. on this topic, and I also wrote this article you are referring to in conversation.com, then it has been published in maybe 20 different newspapers online in the US and elsewhere. I couldn't satisfy anyone, interestingly, because the members of the Gülen movement, they didn't like to be seen similar to Muslim Brothers, because for them Muslim Brothers is an Islamist organization, and for Gülenists it's a kind of offensive word to be defined as similar to Islamists. And for AKP people, Muslim Brothers are good guy, Gülenists are the bad guy, and even comparing them as I did in my article is unacceptable totally. And for some Republicans in the United States, any type of Islamic groups now appear to be violent, radical, and analyzing them is at least waste of time or an apology. So the feedback, interestingly, seems to be critical, but that's fine. I didn't try to satisfy any group. I make my analysis. If it makes sense, people read and learn something, and critical analyses are fine.
And it sounds like the article got a lot of attention, which I guess is the bigger point, right?
Yeah, definitely, because many people read, thousands of people read without any feedback. Those who wrote feedbacks are a small minority. It's reached thousands, and therefore I think for many people the comparison made sense.
Yeah, one thing you say about both groups is that they're not good at choosing friends. You point to Morsi promoting al-Sisi, who would later oust him in a coup, of course, and the Gülenists hooking up with Erdoğan. But I'd say Erdoğan was a natural ally and maybe the best possible choice for the Gülenists. I mean, they rode those AKP links to a position of strength within the state. I might argue that instead of choosing the wrong friends, the Gülenists were simply too good at infiltrating the police, the judiciary, the military. They were too ambitious and too successful. What do you think of that?
In the short run, you're right. Yes, it seems to be an effective alliance for both parts, and they succeeded to eliminate the secularist establishment. We may call them the Kemalist establishment. But in the long run, when we look at the consequences, it's dreadful. It is really deadly for the Gülen movement, and it's clearly the wrong choice. Could they have seen that coming? I think, yeah, some, at least in the some in the movement should have seen it. It's coming, or at least there could have been a balance or a certain level of being more cautious about the support. For example, so the English metaphor, not putting all the eggs in the same basket. Mm-hmm. So the movement in the 1990s and even early 2000 were very careful to put all those eggs in the same basket. But after 2006, the assassination of some court members, Danıştay, the Turkish State Council of State, and 2006 event. There happened a very strong alliance between the Gülenists and the AKP against the so-called Ergenekon, or the deep state. Mm-hmm. And you may say the same thing about Muslim Brothers. Nasser in 1950s was the good choice for them to have a partnership. Nasser has been the most powerful politician and military leader of Egypt, let's say for centuries maybe. But at the end, he turns against Muslim Brothers, crushed them. And therefore, in both cases, yes, in the short run, one may say that it was a rational choice, rational decision. But in both cases, Muslim Brothers and Gülenists were too much enthusiastic, too much sensitive, and they didn't really keep a rational balancing and limits in their partnership, and the results are so devastating.
You also write that the Brotherhood and Gülenist stories offer a cautionary tale for Islamic groups across the region. Is that one of the lessons, that they have to be a little bit more careful in their relationships? What else might they learn?
I think so. You start with one of the three is a very good start for the listeners, because I mentioned three issues. One is, as you emphasize, the wrong partnership. The other is utopian Islam. And it also tells many cautionary points of tale for the other Muslim groups around the world. Because when you think that by sheer Islamic knowledge is the solution of everything, this utopian notion may encourage your members for a while, but it creates many problems. One is that your movement, your party undermine the importance of expertise, the importance of meritocratic understanding of social system. And it's now clearly visible in AKP. They make fun of politicians like professors like myself, or journalists like yourself, doctors, medical doctors, they make fun of, because for them, this kind of expertise, especially based on some Western education, Western training, and the idea of science, etc., are all underestimated. Why? Because if you are Muslim, you know better, you are superior, and your religious knowledge is the key to any dilemma and a solution to any problems.
That also touches on what I think is a common problem for both groups, is that they're anti-intellectual. You know, they have a lack of openness to new ways of thinking about Islam and about political issues.
Definitely. And Gökhan Bacık wrote an article about the Gülen movement per se, about the lack of intellectual emphasis. And I observe it about the Muslim Brotherhood. I conducted interviews in 2013, January, 6 months before the coup against Morsi. I realized that most leadership members of the top echelons of the Muslim Brothers were either engineers or medical doctors. Then when I conducted interviews with one of them, I expressed my concern, saying that you cannot rule an entire country and you don't have philosophical and social scientific depth with just engineers and medical doctors. And he said, Erbakan was also an engineer, what's wrong with it? Anyhow, so then I went to Tunisia, and I talked to Rashid Ghannouchi's daughter and asked her the same question. And she said, we are different, she said. Look, my father, Rashid Ghannouchi, has a philosophical training, and I myself, she said, has a law degree in Cambridge. So Ennahda in Tunisia was different. That's what she told me. That's what I observed. And as a result, Ennahda had much more balanced, more cautionary, and they did not establish an alliance with Salafis in Tunisia. They established alliance with secularists. They are deeper in terms of their understanding of worldview. I talked to Rashid Ghannouchi. He told me that they had no goal of putting Sharia in the constitution, and whereas Muslim Brothers were obsessed with the idea of putting Sharia rules into the constitution. And going back to your point, yes, anti-intellectualism, has been a problem for Muslim brothers, a problem for Gülenists, and any successful groups like Ennahda is more successful because of more emphasis on intellectualism. And even AKP, in fact, had some intellectuals, PhDs, etc. at the beginning. Davutoğlu himself appeared to be an intellectual, but now AKP is also becoming more and more anti-intellectual. That's a big problem.
This links to your new book, Islam, Authoritarianism, and Underdevelopment. In the book, you pose a simple question. Why do Muslim-majority countries exhibit high levels of authoritarianism and relatively low levels of socioeconomic development? Most analysts have pointed either to problems inherent within Islam or to the lingering after effects of colonialism. But you argue that neither of those is the main issue. So what is it?
Yeah, you are absolutely right about the connection between the article and the book, because the problem of intellectualism is a long-lasting with a deep historical roots. So when we look at the Muslim world, the average scores of democracy and development is not only lower than the average of Western world, but also lower than the world in general. Then when I ask, and when you ask the people in the West, there is a certain level of Islamophobia, especially in the conservative right. And they say it's because of Islam. When you ask in the Middle East, people generally blame the West, from the Crusader all the way to colonization. And these two arguments, Islam and colonization, have resonance in the literature too. There are social scientists supporting these arguments. I criticize them, and my alternative is that when Muslims had progressive and productive intellectuals and bourgeoisie, they had a brilliant civilization from 7th to 11th century. About 4 to 5 centuries, Muslims were producing cutting-edge philosophers, cutting-edge economic innovators. They innovated such concepts and institutions as check in economy, or they had a monetary system when Europeans did not have the monetary system. And this intellectual flourishing in the early Islamic era was a result of a diverse, open-minded civilization where intellectual production was deeply appreciated. But after the 11th century, I analyze in the book and explain in details two different classes, state authorities and religious authorities. I call them ulama. They establish an alliance and they marginalize the intellectuals and the bourgeoisie. But in fact, the intellectuals and the bourgeoisie were the motors, they were the engine of the early civilization. And after the marginalization of them, Muslim civilization ended up with a stagnation and certain level of backwardness.
So the independence of Islamic scholars centuries ago enabled freedom of thought, which in turn led to innovation and development. So when Muslim states began to incorporate a specific line of Islamic thinking into their state ideology and foundations, that curbed intellectualism, creativity, dissent, and led to stagnation.
Definitely.
Okay. And you point to the Seljuk Empire, which started in the 11th century as one of the first states defined in part by its reliance to the ulama, to links to Islam and Muslim scholars.
Exactly. So for those who are critical of my book, one point they keep asking me is that, Ahmet, how can you explain the golden era of the Ottoman Empire? Because my analysis point to 11th century, much earlier than the Ottomans were even established. Then I said that, look, my chapter on the Ottoman Empire is called Power, not Progress. The Ottomans were militarily very powerful, but intellectually and economically they were not creative. So from the Seljuks to the Mamluks and the Ottomans, when the Islamic scholars lost their financial independence, they lost their creativity and they became state servants. And then that was the end of the Muslim intellectual production, slowing down and losing its brilliance and creativity. But one point I want to emphasize is that when Muslim modernists in the late 19th century and early 20th century, from the Mustafa Kemal Atatürk to Turkey to Cemal Abdel Nasser in Egypt and Habib Bourguiba in Tunisia, they attacked the ulama, but that did not mean that they appreciate intellectuals. While undermining the ulama, these Muslim modernists overemphasize and empower the state. They empower the bureaucrats. So for a top-down modernist, Kemalist, or in Arab modernist, intellectuals are either unnecessary, unhelpful, or they are dangerous because they are critical, because they ask questions, because they challenge the state authority. So that's why, although my book is critical of the classical ulama-state alliance and Orthodox Sunni and Orthodox Shia versions of Islam, the book is also critical of modernist attempts in Turkey and elsewhere because most of these modernist leaders were military generals. Therefore, they did not appreciate enough the role of intellectuals. They did not appreciate enough the role of bourgeoisie. So for this top-down modernists, both the intellectuals and the bourgeoisie were really problem makers, and both they tried to put professors, academics, journalists, authors, all intellectuals under state control, as well as putting all economic classes under state control. So that's why the modernist attempts fail in the Muslim world, and therefore an assertive secularist top-down modernization is not the solution to the problems I emphasize in the book.
Yeah, you point out in the book that in Muslim countries, secularist leaders are often authoritarian and nationalist rather than champions of intellectual freedom, and often develop a cult of personality. I mean, this made me think of Ataturk.
Yeah, he is one of them, and many of them, in fact, imitated him. Reza Shah in Iran, then Habib Bourguiba in Tunisia, and then we have similar leaders, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto in Pakistan, and Sukarno in Indonesia. So most of them were part of a trend from 1923 to 1979. After the Iranian Revolution of 79, a new trend of Islamization began. And in almost all Muslim countries, we experience legal and political Islamization. In Iran, a revolution top-down. In Egypt, a bottom-up revolution has happened. And Turkey also experienced some level of political Islamization at this public discourse level. But Islamization didn't help at all. It reproduced many problems.
Well, that's the
because,
as you point out in the book, I mean, just yesterday, Erdoğan celebrated the Seljuk victory at Manzikert. So it's interesting to see the AKP celebrating what you portray as the beginning of the decline of Islamic culture.
Exactly. It's ironic, right?
Yeah. And you also...
let me tell you that because our criteria are different. For Erdoğan and Erdoğanists, the important thing is to have military power, state control, order, and national pride. For me, I look at production, intellectual production, economic production, and I don't see it in this Seljuk legacy.
Yeah. You also point out that it was Muslim Brotherhood founder Hassan alBanna who played a key role in spreading this idea in modern times that Islam and the state were inextricably linked and interwoven.
Yes.
Yeah.
In fact, Hassan alBanna and others took the idea of ulama-state alliance even to more extreme points because, look, the book argues that the idea of state-religion brotherhood has nothing to do with Islam. It's a Sasanian idea, a Persian empire, Sasani Empire, and its famous king, Ardashir I, and about 3 centuries before Prophet Muhammad. He was the king, and he has the Sasani king had a famous statement: the state and the religion are brothers. One cannot live without the other. So in the 11th century, when things change, a new political and economic mode of production, political relationship established, they need a justification. And they took this Persian king's maxim, brotherhood of religion and state, and said this is a prophet's hadith. And based on this fake hadith, there emerged literature. So for centuries, there was this ulema-state alliance because of economic and political interests really fit. When it came, as you mentioned, Hassan alBanna, the Islamists, they went even further because alBanna says, Islam ad-din wa dawla, which means Islam is both religion and the state. So it is a monistic understanding that it's not combining political, it's not a partnership, it's just a unification. It's even more dangerous, more utopian, and more irrational.
So you were saying that post the Iranian Revolution in 1979, Islamization has increased significantly across the region, and it's been a boon for Islamist groups and Islamic groups. Would you say that since the fall of the Muslim Brotherhood and the Gulenists now, that trend is starting to reverse, or not?
That's a very good question. That's I think in our previous podcast interview, Ahval Pod interview with you, David, we discussed my brief essay about the expectation or prediction of a secularist backlash.
Yes, yes.
So I really believe in the action-reaction circle. I observe it in my book on secularism. I explain how in the United States, church-state relations had action-reaction pendulum swinging from one side to other. And in the Turkish history or beyond Turkey, in the Muslim world, as we have talked today, there was a cycle of secularist leaders, a trend from 20s to, let's say, 79. And the last 40 years, we saw a new trend for various reasons, anti-communism and the reaction to secularist failures. And now it's time to talk about the failures of Islamist regimes, the failures of Islamist communities and parties. It is time to see a secularist backlash. I hope this time, instead of seeing a secularist dictatorship and authoritarian mood, we somehow reach a middle ground, an Aristotelian synthesis, golden mean, a more democratic way of seeing a secularist backlash. I can only hope that.
Mm-hmm. Towards the end of your book, you write that electoral democracies constitute more than half of all countries in the world, but less than 1/5 of the 49 Muslim majority countries. So what, according to your research, might these Muslim majority countries do to reduce authoritarianism and boost democracy and development?
So a major question social scientists try to grapple with is the relationship between ideas and material factors. I think in your question about the contemporary authoritarianism in the Muslim world, both ideas matter and material factors matter. Ideas, I call them in the book medieval ideas. So when, for example, an Islamic tariqah, Islamic community followers believe that when they die, they are in the deathbed, the Satan, devil, will come to steal their faith, and their sheikh come to help them. And with the help of their sheikh, the Sufi guru, they keep their faith and go to heaven. So if someone believes this kind of hierarchy, a religious authority determining your hereafter rather than your personal deed and faith and practice, it's really unthinkable, very difficult to think about democracy in such a context of religious beliefs and community and sheikh disciple relationship. So there are ideas about hierarchy, about gender inequality, about the caliphate. which really makes Muslim countries more likely to be authoritarian. For example, in the Islamic thought literature, there are three main scholars who writes about political issues: Ghazali, Mawardi, and Ibn Taymiyyah. Two of them 11th century, one of them 13th and early 14th century. And in their theory, the political system is based on a caliph, a leader, who is supposed to be a man, who is supposed to be from Quraysh tribe, an Arab tribe, who is supposed to be chosen, elected, came to power, and stay until he dies. There is no theory of checks and balances, no theory of power transition in a peaceful way. So if Islamists or conservatives really wants to follow their tradition, there is no place of democracy in that tradition. That's the idea.
I thought it was interesting. You write that today's Islamic leaders and Islamist leaders are still looking for solutions in political literature.
Exactly, yeah, medieval. It's really surprising, but it's the fact, yeah. But on the other hand, there is also a material reality, which is rentierism. So I analyze in specific details in the book that it's just by chance that 60% of world's oil and gas reserves happen to be in Muslim territories. And this oil and gas rent, we call them gift of nature. Rent is not based on laboring and production, but it's just your territory has the oil and you earn money. This dominates Muslim economies, and these rentier economies is not based on taxation. Therefore, in the American Revolution, the motto was no taxation without representation, and Americans claim their right of representation. But the king of Saudi Arabia may say, no representation without taxation. You, the people, don't pay me tax. I have the oil money. I don't need your money. In fact, I allocate money to you. Therefore, I am not going to give you representation. So that's the case in many Muslim countries. And even in Turkey, which is oil poor, you know that in the Gezi event and in other cases, Erdoğan is selling Istanbul and other big cities' land as a source of rent, because ulema-state alliance and this Islamic authoritarian model can only survive with rent. And Muslims now have oil rent, which is sufficient to reproduce the system.
It's good that you mentioned Gezi. Let me just finish up with a couple questions about recent news in Turkey. So many people said after the March elections and the June rerun vote in which İmamoğlu won easily, they expected this secularist backlash that you predicted, secularist wave to come to power, if not come to power, at least make a significant impact soon. But now, last week, Erdoğan dismisses these top Kurdish mayors. So now people are fearing a return to more authoritarian ways. What is your take on what's happening in Turkey the last couple of weeks?
I think if there is no social resistance and political strategy, Erdoğan will probably assign some bureaucrats to the mayor seats in Istanbul and Ankara. What he did in the Kurdistan is the first step. His prize, his main goal is to take back Ankara and Istanbul. And
wow, I really think that. Yeah. They've done Kurdish cities before, so it wasn't all that shocking. But you're saying he wants to take Istanbul and Ankara.
Yeah, because financially he needs Istanbul. Istanbul mayor budget funds many disciples of Erdoğan. And he lives in Ankara and Istanbul, and he is not a person with ability to accept power sharing. And he didn't share power, even Abdullah Gül, even Ahmet Davutoğlu. So he is not going to share with İmamoğlu and Yavaş, the two mayors of Ankara and Istanbul. If there is no sufficient social resistance or political strategy, he will do that. That's what I predict.
So you think right now they're considering ways to perhaps make İmamoğlu and Yavaş look bad or like criminals so that they can oust them without too much resistance.
Exactly. Yeah, that's the way he does politics. That's the Erdoğan's way.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. Thanks so much for talking to us, Ahmet.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure, and thanks for your inspirational questions.